Yeah, we're here today to burn piles. Burning piles is generally a low cost and low risk way to reduce fuels, hazardous fuels within forested lands. And as a lot of people know, we had a mountain pine beetle epidemic during the early 2000s that created really hazardous fuel loading across the landscape, and we're still cleaning that up today. So burning piles is just one really good way to reduce that risk to our communities and landscape from catastrophic fire, and one way to create places that we can engage the fire safely and effectively to protect those communities and those landscapes. There are other options other than burning piles. They're somewhat limited, however. Things like harvesting that lumber, that timber for biomass and biomass energy production is one option. But unfortunately, we can't get log trucks and heavy equipment to every treatment area, so we're left with other options, and pile burning tends to be our best one.
We shoot for around 60 to 90% consumption of the piles. That's our goal. Very typically up here, especially with these big machine piles, we get right to the 90% consumption rate. They burn pretty hot and they burn through. So our goal is to reduce the fuels on the landscape. So burning the piles is what finishes that job. So we really look for as much consumption as we can.
We have a lot of piles in Summit County, literally thousands. As we move through the cycle of producing those piles and then burning them off, we could have as few as 1,000 or as many as 15,000, just depending on the time of the season and the year. Pile burning is relatively low risk. Not to say no risk, but we put everything in our favor to do so and make it and do it with the least risk possible. So we add very specific conditions to burn those piles within. As you look around us today, we've got snow across the area. We look for good snow coverage both within the unit and outside the unit. What that allows for is it prevents that creep from the pile, and it prevents embers from taking hold in vegetation or even structures if they were to encounter them, which again is really low risk. The cold temperatures tend to it pulls the heat out of those embers, pulls the heat out of the piles in the perimeter, so you just don't see a whole lot of expansion of those piles. So we look for very specific atmospheric conditions. One of our primary concerns is the effect to the community from smoke impact. So we follow guidelines set by Colorado Public Health and follow the permitting process that allows us to burn under certain conditions as specified. We need enough wind to generate some mixing within the atmosphere, and that gets the smoke up and out of the site and away from the community and limits our impact to the community itself. So addressing this fuels problem has been ongoing for decades, and it's going to continue to be an ongoing thing that we need to address. And it really takes all of our land management agencies and private land owners to address this problem. So you have agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, Colorado State Forest Service, your county governments, your local fire protection districts, as well as landowners themselves, ranch owners, HOAs, and all of us need to come together and start addressing and continue to address this fuels problem because it doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries. So we need to create the space to protect our communities and the landscape itself, the resource itself. So generally what we're looking for site conditions would be 2 inches of snow across the ground up to mid-shin, and our staff members, whether they're U.S. Forest Service or your local fire protection district, they move pile to pile and light those piles using a mix of gasoline and diesel fuel and what's called a drip torch, or perhaps a small butane torch. And so they go pile to pile and they look for fine materials that are built in the center of the pile with heavier materials around the outside. So we get that fine material going, and then it consumes the rest of the pile. And the crews just move pile to pile, working with the wind and with the conditions. So in general, we tend to achieve approximately 80–90% of pile consumption. So what gets left behind in some cases would be something of a skeleton. Those coarse woody debris elements they fall into the fire scar and help to regenerate with grasses and forbs and new seedlings that come after that pile burn. So in general, the piles stay as they are once they're consumed. In rare cases, we will go back and add some seed to those piles, but in general, they reproduce on their own, and grasses and forbs come in the next kind of 5 to 7, sometimes 10 years, and those fire scars disappear over that time frame. Quite often these piles need to sit and cure. If they have any kind of live material in them, if we've cut green trees mixed in with dead trees, those piles may sit for an entire summer, sometimes 2, as we wait for the right conditions to burn those piles. What we ask of the public is to not disturb those piles. Quite often people are tempted to pull wood from it for their stoves, for campfires, etc. We really need you to avoid doing that, because what you're doing is you're interrupting how that pile will burn. We're trying to protect the inside of that pile from weather so that we can burn that effectively. There have been limited cases where we've tried to allow the public to come and get wood collection from these units. Unfortunately, people don't take enough, and we don't meet the mission, which is to reduce fuel loading on the landscape.